We are mostly concerned about sodium, potassium, and calcium. Those are the three electrolytes that we're going to focus on. And you can understand why sodium and chloride together, and then potassium and calcium, the big electrolytes that we're going to focus on, because they have a lot to do with osmotic pressure, moving fluids back and forth. We've already mentioned how many times sodium and chloride have to do with moving water in the kidneys. Wherever sodium and chloride are, water follows. We also have mentioned on many occasions why potassium is so important, and we've talked about calcium as well, why they're so important. They are essential for maintaining homeostasis. It's the bottom line. And I love this image right here. We look at where each of these electrolytes are found, either in the blood plasma or our intracellular fluid, inside the cell versus outside the cell. The concentration of sodium outside the cell, quite high, 145 milliequivalents of sodium in the blood plasma compared to 12 milliequivalents in the cell. And remember that we also have sodium dripping in, down its concentration gradient, and potassium dripping out, down its concentration gradient, but we then have those sodium-potassium pumps working to maintain that polarity. Potassium, enormous amount of potassium inside the cells, very little potassium outside the cells. We want to keep it that way. Chloride, inside the cell, more chloride outside the cell. These two tend to go together, sodium chloride salt. Calcium, inside the cell, really low. Calcium outside the cell, really low. Why?
It's used for muscle contraction.
And neurons.
We also have potassium inside the cell.
Heather, is this on the, I can't find this on the PowerPoint. Is it on the lecture in week 7? Sorry.
Week 8.
Week 8? Oh, thank you, sorry.
Oh, because I'm a little ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
So, if we have calcium and potassium in the same place, what do we make?
Calcium phosphate.
Yes, calcium phosphate, and calcium phosphate is also known as skeleton, bone. Yeah, so if you put calcium and phosphate in the same region, they can find each other and make calcium phosphate, and then you got bone growing. So we like to keep calcium sequestered. We like to keep it contained, right? We got sequestrin, we got calmodulin, we keep calcium in its own little space. So that, because we have phosphate, we've got a lot of phosphate. Sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate
Need
for
phosphate.
DNA and RNA.
Calcium phosphate's another type of kidney stone too.
Okay.
So if you get them together and they'll
They
form the heart, they'll
crystallize.
crystallize. Okay.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
you want them sequestered.
We want to keep the calcium separated from the phosphate. Yeah. So notice this, that we have the same osmolarity in the cell as we do outside the cell. It's just different balances, different electrolytes that provide for that same osmolarity. Sodium imbalances, it's kind of interesting. We generally don't think of sodium imbalances as being an issue, and it really isn't a terrible issue because sodium is largely contained outside the cells in the extracellular fluid. So we can get to it. We can manage sodium levels. Right? But if our sodium levels get out of balance, we might have something called hypernatremia, or we might have hyponatremia. And hypernatremia is the result of dehydration, or diabetes insipidus, where we have ADH is an issue. Hypernatremia, we don't have enough water, we have too much sodium, right? Because we peed the water out. Hypersecretion of aldosterone, or administration of hypertonic saline. These are all causes for increased sodium. Increased sodium means above 145 milliequivalents per deciliter, per liter, excuse me, in the extracellular fluid. Dehydration, we understand. Right, we've lost water through sweat. That pulls it from the circulation, dehydration. hypersecretion of aldosterone, increase our sodium content, increase in the blood. Administration of hypertonic saline. There might be a situation where you don't get normal saline, 0.9% saline. You don't get even lower saline concentrations. You might get something greater than 0.9% saline. Can we think about something we just talked about that would benefit from increased sodium concentration to move water out?
The nephron, the loops, the tubes.
No, we're not talking about anatomy here. We're talking about a condition,
Oh, a condition.
a situation, a condition.
To move
Does it
it.
have too much water?
Too much water. The hypotonic hydration.
Oh, that, okay.
Right? If you have somebody that is hypotonic hydration, your dog collapses, you take it to the emergency, they're going to administer a really high concentration saline to pull that water out, to remove it from the system. If you have too much sodium, increased blood volume and pressure, back to kidney stones, back to hypertension. That's why people with hypertension are told to limit the amount of sodium they include in their diet. So it's easy enough to deal with hypernatremia. It's easy because sodium is outside the cells. Easy to move it, easy to control its levels. The opposite, hyponatremia, is not so easy to deal with. And before I started looking into it, this pretty much said, oh, it rarely happens in the United States because we have plenty of sodium in our diet. Hyponatremia means that we have lower than 135 milliequivalents per liter of sodium. And this is going to seem like an insignificant fact here, but if we lose 1 milliequivalent of sodium, if you were to take this 1 milliequivalent and divide it, we would come up with a 1% loss of this 135 milliequivalents of sodium. It doesn't seem like a big deal, and it isn't until we look at what happens with potassium, and we lose potassium. And we're talking about extracellular fluid here, always extracellular fluid, right? I had a neighbor, he had hyponatremia, and it was devastating for him because it affected his mental acuity, it affected how he functioned on a daily basis. Why? Because sodium is essential for polarization, depolarization. Without depolarization, we got no muscle contraction. And same for bulimia, water volume in the brain. Hyponatremia. So pathological hyponatremia causes brain cells to fill up with water. Why? Because the cells have a greater concentration of sodium than the exterior, than the extracellular fluid. So water pours into those cells. Same with that hypotonic bulimia, right? Hypotonic hydration, excuse me. Yeah, this is significant, this hyponatremia. So if somebody tries to tell you that it's not a big deal, it actually is. And it's way more significant than hypernatremia. We can deal with hypernatremia, but hyponatremia, and they gave him sodium like drips and increased it, but it didn't change his overall condition. He was a mess, poor guy. He is a former alcoholic and Vietnam veteran. He just had a lot of stuff. So let's keep this in mind. If we lose 1 milliequivalent of sodium, we only lose 1% of our sodium concentration. But if we lose 1 milliequivalent of potassium, we are actually going to lose approximately 20% of the potassium in our extracellular fluids. And this is going to be the thing that we have to think about, especially because potassium levels, potassium imbalances are very dangerous. Because remember that potassium is something contained within the cells, right? We have high concentration of potassium inside the cells than we do outside the cells. But when we talk about potassium imbalances, we're referring to the extracellular fluid because we don't get inside the cell. It's the outside of the cell that we can impact. Does everybody follow me on that? So that's why you'll see I have this like underlined and bolded. It's the extracellular fluid that we're concerned with when we talk about imbalances. And this potassium imbalance is the most dangerous of the electrolyte imbalances. So, if we have hypokalemia, low potassium, And by the way, look at how many places we can get potassium. So there's no reason to be lacking in potassium. You can get it from virtually anything you eat. It contains potassium. So if we have low potassium, hypokalemia, less than 3.5 milliequivalent potassium in the extracellular fluid, it means that we have lost 28% of the potassium in the extracellular fluid. Causes of hypersecretion caused by hypersecretion of aldosterone. What's aldosterone do? Remember, aldosterone pumps sodium, potassium back in, chloride follows, then water follows, and then we have potassium shifted out, secreted out at the distal convoluted tubule in the kidneys. But if we have hypersecretion of aldosterone, sodium can be exchanged for potassium. It means we're, right?
Putting too much potassium outside the cell.
Yes, yes, yes. Alkalosis, potassium exchange for sodium and hydrogen ions. Hydrogen's exchanged for the bicarbonate in kidneys. Heavy sweating, any of these can lead to a loss of potassium. Why do we care? Because we need the potassium inside the cell. We can't lose it from potassium dripping outside the cell. Hang on, hang on. Vomiting, diarrhea, all losing potassium. Where's the potassium going to come from? It's going to come from inside the cell. If we lose the extracellular, because remember, our potassium inside the cell, sure, but we still have some outside the cell, 3 to 5 milliequivalents. If that's dropped, we've lost 28% of that normally contained, retained potassium in the extracellular fluid. If we have a loss of this much potassium in the extracellular fluid, our muscle cells become hyperpolarized. Let's look at how that happens. So here we have a normal movement of potassium in and out of the cells. Remember, we're always dripping down the concentration gradient. Sodium potassium pump is pushing that potassium back in, but we're always going to be maintaining a 3 to 5 milliequivalent population of potassium ions in the extracellular fluid. And we maintain our resting membrane potential this way. If we have a loss of potassium from the extracellular fluid for vomiting, diarrhea, whatever the cause is, we're going to see a greater efflux of potassium from inside the cells. And this means that these cells are now not as positively charged. Remember, hyperpolarization happened when we closed the sodium gates, but the potassium gates were still open and potassium was leaving, and now we created a more negative environment, a greater shift between the inside and the outside of the cells, millivolt-wise. Remember that? So we're about minus 70 millivolts difference. Now we make it minus 80. And those cells are now less excitable. Why do we care about this? What cells do we really care about being excitable? Neurons and
Muscle cells.
heart muscle.
Yeah.
Heart muscle. Yeah. So if your heart muscle is hyperpolarized, it's not going to want to contract 65 to 75 times a minute. That's a problem. Yeah, that's a problem. And I just give you this to remind you that we have our resting membrane potential, then we have our graded potentials. The graded potentials add up. Finally, we hit threshold. Boom! Sodium gated channels open. Sodium gated channels closed. Potassium gated channels open, 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 open. Finally, we close the potassium gated channels and we get back to our resting membrane potential. But if we have lots of potassium leaving these cells become hyperpolarized. And they're leaving the cell, they're effluxing because our concentration outside the cell has been diminished. Everybody catching on to this? Good. The opposite is hyperkalemia. That means that we have a rush or a steady drip, drip, drip of potassium leaving the cells. So when we have a crushing accident, where we have a rapid efflux, a rapid deposition of potassium into the extracellular fluid space, we have a problem. We have a problem with cells that are now hyper-excitable. Imagine you're in a car accident, your muscles are crushed. Where's the potassium contained? Inside your cells. You crush all these muscles, all that potassium flushes out. Now we have the opposite of this, now we have tons of potassium outside the cell, along with sodium outside the cell, making those cells extra excitable. Not so good for the heart. Arrhythmias. And these can kill you. They use potassium to kill people.
Oh.
Lethal
For
injections.
lethal injections, potassium.
Which drives your heart to wreck and ruin. Yeah. So that's rapid efflux of potassium from the inside of the cells to the outside of the cells. Just think of a crushing accident. All those cells are destroyed, ruined, opened, and that potassium floods out. The opposite is if you have a slow efflux of those potassium ions. They're drip, 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 dripping. Drip, 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 dripping. Which means now that we're going to go back to hyperpolarized because we're in this range right here. Sodium gated channels are closed, but the potassium is just drip, drip, dripping out, and it's making the outside of the cell more positively charged than the inside of the cell. And then your heart muscles, I always think of the heart because this is the one that's going to be mostly impacted. Just got one heart. You're going to have hyperpolarization, less excitable. So potassium's a big deal because our muscle cells, our neurons, they are dependent on that sodium-potassium balanced polarity. And when that gets damaged, especially with imbalances of potassium, because it's normally in high concentration inside the cell, and we change that, we have problems with those excitable cells, especially cardiac muscle and neurons. Yeah.
Wait, I'm a little bit confused, because up there it says excitable cells to be hyper-excitable.
Mm-hmm.
And then below it says they become less excitable.
Hyperexcitable, right. So if you have this rapid efflux of potassium and your sodium gated channels are all already open, and you have tons of potassium as well as sodium, then you are on this side
Okay.
of that, right?
Hmm.
Sodium gated channels haven't closed, they're open, potassium's out, sodium's out. In, I should say. Out. High sodium potassium concentration outside the cell. No?
I'll rewatch the video a few times.
Think it through. Here we have our normal resting membrane potential. Sodium in, or potassium out, resting membrane potential. What if we have a crushing event and we have extra potassium outside these cells? Then this extra potassium outside the cells is going to be entering into the cells, just like the sodium is entering into the cells, and we have a hyperexcitable cell.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so we have this extra efflux of potassium from the event, and whatever it is, hemorrhage, crushing muscle, whatever damage happened that produced a lot of potassium in the extracellular fluid. Yeah. We're going to stop there. We'll finish this on Monday. Now I want you to work on your nephron. I want you to draw me a nephron.